So JR here is past president of the MSSF. He's stepping down as many years as fungus fair chair. And he's a lecturer at SF State and teaches biology over there. Right. And he's also the Sierra Nevada Field Campus director.
Yeah, so far so good.
So far so good. It hasn't burned down yet, only been broken into every year. Twice this year. And he's going to give us one of his talks he said I haven't heard before, so I'm looking forward to that. J.R. Blair.
Thank you, everyone, and thanks, Tyler, for shutting off the lights. I usually do that, so I had to do some training.
3 months.
Yeah. Just to introduce myself a little bit more, and then I want to give some acknowledgments before I get started. I have been a member of the Mycological Society of San Francisco since 1984. That was back in the last century. And I decided that I liked mushrooms study so much that after 11 years after I got my bachelor's degree, where I studied mushrooms up in Washington State, I went back and got my master's degree, and I acquired that in 1999 at San Francisco State University. My major professor is was Dr. Dennis Desjardins, who is our science advisor, and really knows his mushrooms really well. So I was fortunate enough to study with him for a number of years. When I finally got my master's degree, they needed warm bodies to teach, mostly in labs, and I was pretty warm at that time. And so I started teaching full-time back then and have been a full-time lecturer since then. So one of the first shout-outs I want to make is thanks to those of my students who are here tonight getting extra credit. Thank you very much for coming. I want to welcome back from far away in a land called Madagascar, Jackie and Danny, who have been doing some studies over there, so welcome back. Thank you. And then, of course, I really appreciate the support that my lovely wife has given me over the years. Thank you, Annie. Every month she lets me take 2 Tuesdays and not come home. All right, so what I'm going to be doing tonight is I'm going to be talking about the basics of what fungi are and all of the roles that they play. The subtitle of my talk is, What is a Mushroom Anyway? And so hopefully I'm not going to bore those of you who already know what a mushroom is. And hopefully you'll learn a little bit about fungi tonight. Okay, so usually when somebody says that word mushroom, they're referring to a type of fruiting body, which is the reproductive structure of a fungus. Most people use that term mushroom to describe a fruiting body that has a stem and a cap. And but there are lots of other types of fruiting bodies as well. So you can see, for example, here's a coral mushroom, here's a shelf fungus, a jelly fungus here. These are puffballs. And this is even a fruiting body right here. That is a crust fungus right there. But it serves the same function. And that is to disperse spores. Now, a spore the definition of a spore is it's a single cell that is capable of cell division, and is usually the propagule of lots of different things. Spores are not always propagules, but they're usually the propagule, which means it's the part of the organism that leaves the parent and goes out into the environment to propagate the species. So, for example, with mushrooms and ferns and mosses, the propagule is a spore. For higher plants, propagule would be a seed. For humans, it's college students. Although they come back sometimes, so that's kind of, well, anyway. Now, spores are small. You need a microscope to see them. Generally, for fungal spores, we're talking about 10 to 20 micrometers or microns. Micrometer is a millionth of a meter, so they're pretty small. Now, when a spore lands in the right place and the conditions are right, then they will basically germinate. They'll grow and divide into chains of cells called hyphae. About 5 years ago, when I said that word to my students, they would start giggling, and I didn't know why. But now I know that it's a type of dance. I think it's gone out of phase now because they don't giggle anymore when I say it. So all of the multicellular fungi and a bunch of other organisms have these kinds of cells, and they also are microscopic. You need a microscope to see it. I just want to say a little bit of a word about the amazing properties of this kind of a cell. So you can see that they're long cylindrical things. They're separated by cell walls. Sometimes there are actually some hyphae that don't have separations between the cells, but most of them do. And you can just imagine the surface area. The contact with the environment is just remarkable. So virtually every cell has 360 degrees of contact. And that may be for acquiring water or acquiring nutrients or actually eating as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. The hyphae grow out and branch into a massive tissue that we call mycelium. The mycelium is the business end of the fungus. It's the part that is out there in the substrate and growing and obtaining food. By the way, I forgot to mention that any of the words that you see in red will be on the exam. Now, I want to say a word about how this happens as well. If you think about animals, such as humans, the way that we eat is by ingesting our food. And then we have special cells in our digestive tract and special organs, and there are special cells lining the digestive tract that secrete acids in the stomach and enzymes elsewhere. And those enzymes are involved with digestion. They're involved with taking proteins and breaking them up into amino acids. They're breaking lipids into fatty acids and breaking carbohydrates into monosaccharides, into smaller units. And then those get absorbed into the bloodstream. And all animals are characterized by having that kind of a digestive process where they have some sort of a gut that they use to do that. Now, fungi don't have that, but they actually have a very similar process. They secrete, these hyphae secrete, the hyphae that are in the mycelium, secrete enzymes out into the substrate, whether it be soil or compost or wood or whatever the case may be. And then they reabsorb the products of those enzymes that have been sent out into the substrate. So that's how they obtain their food. Now, mycelia from two different individuals can then fuse, and ladies and gentlemen, that is the extent of mushroom sex. Let's move on. At a certain point in the life cycle of the fungus, they will produce mushrooms, fruiting bodies, right? And the way that works is that when the time is right, these hyphae, which actually I forgot to mention that they're amazing structures for channeling nutrients. So basically they can pass these nutrients from one cell to the next. And they send these to these special masses of hyphae called pinheads. And those pinheads will... Oh, sorry, wrong pinhead. Okay, there they are. Yeah, I can always tell the age of my group by whether they get that joke or not. Okay, so here's some pinheads. This is an oyster mushroom kit. The white stuff is mycelium. The yellow stuff is straw, the substrate which the mycelium is getting its food from. And these little clusters right here then are pinheads and will be growing up to be mushrooms. A fancy term for those, by the way, mycologists don't say pinheads. They say primoria. Well, go figure. And then these pinheads then will fill up with water, basically. So at a certain point in the growth of the pinhead, it will have all of the cells that it eventually will need, and then all it needs is water to fill that up and expand that into a fruiting body. Okay, now once the fruiting body is expanded out, then it produces the spores. And the spores are produced on some sort of a fertile surface. For most of what you're familiar with, that fertile surface will be gills, like this right here. And by the way, I have to say that these structures right here cannot extract oxygen out of water. Sorry. But they call them gills anyway. Somebody thought it looked like fish gills. Now, other fruiting bodies will have tubes. Like, for example, here's a bolete. And so those tubes, which look like a sponge bottom at the surface, those are just the bottom ends of these tubes, and the spores are produced up inside of those. Here is a toothed fungus. This is the cat's tongue fungus, cat's tongue mushroom, and on those little teeth right there are produced the spores. Or it could be on the interior, for example, puffballs and truffles, or it can be just on an exposed surface like a coral fungus or a club fungus or a cup fungus or something like that. Okay, here's the point at which I'm going to let you take a nap. Okay. This is a life cycle of a mushroom, and I'm going to go through it fairly quickly and fairly simply. And we'll start with the spores. So here are two spores, and the red dot and the blue dot represent the nuclei that are in those spores. Now, spore nuclei are not really red or blue. What this cartoon is representing is that these are two different mating types. And now, animals have two different mating types, males and females. And so a male gamete, a sperm cell, for example, cannot fuse with another male gamete to produce a zygote, an offspring. It needs an egg, a female gamete, in order for that to occur. So that's what's meant basically by mating types, is that in order for sex to happen, there needs to be different mating types. Now, fungi are a bit different. There are up to, depending on the fungus, there are up to 100 different mating types. It's very kinky. So, but it allows for kind of an added benefit here. So this, say this red one right here, doesn't matter whether it meets a blue one or a green one or a purple one or a pink one or a yellow one, or it doesn't matter what it runs into, it can still fuse with that, and because they're different mating types. Now, if it were to run into another red one, that would be a problem, and so they would not mate in that case. So again, here is that process of mushroom sex that's happening, what they call cytoplasmic fusion. This is where the two cells then fuse together and into one. Now, this happens with animals as well. And so when the sperm cell and the egg cell encounter each other, they fuse together. And then immediately what happens after that is that the nuclei, the nucleus from the sperm cell fuses with the nucleus of the egg cell. For those of you who are in the know, that is the process of going from a haploid stage with one set of cells, or one set of chromosomes, to a diploid stage where the cell now has a set of chromosomes from mom and a set of chromosomes from dad. But you'll notice in all of these cells right here, this mycelium right now, that the blue cells and the red cells have not fused together. They don't do that until, in fungi, they wait. They don't do that until much further down the road. Okay, so here's the mycelium. Things are going along hunky-dory. The conditions are right, forms the pinhead. The pinhead blows up into a mushroom with added water. And here's the gills, or it could be tubes, or it could be any of the fertile surfaces, depending on the species. on the gills there are terminal cells. So this is a cell right here that's at the sort of the end of the line. It's all of the other cells are supporting it, basically. There's several terminal cells here, actually, but we're going to concentrate on that one. So again, the red nucleus and the blue nucleus are still separate from each other. Once this happens, so now we're talking about on a mature, ripe mushroom that's ready to release its spores, then nuclear fusion, the fusion of the two nuclei, happens, and you get this. You get there's the diploid stage. We have two sets of chromosomes in that red and blue cell. I don't know why they didn't make it purple. You get the idea. And then immediately what happens is the process of splitting that up into spores, the process of meiosis. And so the diploid stage for fungi is very short, very, very fleeting. Whereas with animals, it's very long, and it's actually the haploid stage that's very short. Once meiosis happens, and with this varies again with the species. Generally, with most mushrooms of this type anyway, they produce 4 spores. Those, 4 nuclei. Those nuclei migrate out to these finger-like structures that are sticking out, and then the spores fall off, and we start all over again. Now, I have to say that this is just one type of mushroom life cycle. This is a group of mushrooms called Basidiomycetes, and the other a group of fungi called that. The other fungal groups have different life cycles, but this gives you an idea of how most fungi undergo their life cycle. By the way, I just want to say that in a typical mushroom, there are going to be literally hundreds of thousands to millions of spores produced. And if you think about that, that's a little overwhelming. If each one of those is going to result in a bunch more mushrooms, we would be in trouble. At least if it was wet, we would be in trouble. I heard a story one time. There's a kind of a mushroom called a giant puffball. And it can weigh a good 10, 15 pounds. Big mushroom. And somebody figured out that if every spore inside of a single giant puffball were to result in another giant puffball, it would weigh more than the Earth. So fortunately, a lot of spores don't survive. They don't end up being other mushrooms. Okay, now let's change gears a little bit. Let's talk about the ecology of mushrooms. My ecology students already know this, but ecology literally means the study of the house in Greek. And it's a study of how organisms, the living organisms, interact with each other and how they interact with the environment. So that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of the talk. They are extremely important. There are 3 ways that they interact, 3 major ways that they interact with the environment. Some of them are primary decomposers of organic material in soil, wood, dead animals, etc., etc. So they're highly involved with the process of decomposition. There are some organisms that actually benefit from their relationship with fungi, and there are also fungi that just do the opposite, that are a detriment to the existence of organisms. So we'll go through those one at a time. First, we'll talk about fungi as decomposers. About half of, every time I do this thing, I keep meaning to change that word fungi to mushrooms. About half of all mushrooms are what are referred to as saprotrophic. So what that means is that they are decomposing dead things. They're eating dead things. Now, some of you may have grown up with the word saprophytic. Well, I'm begging you to drop that word because it doesn't really mean anything. Sapro means dead. Phytic means plant. Saprotrophic, on the other hand, is much more accurate in terms of its usage. Sapro again means dead. Trophic means how it eats. Okay, so Saprotrophic organisms are organisms that are eating dead things. About 1/2 of the microbial biomass in compost is fungal in nature. The other half is bacterium. So that, they're really, really important in that respect. I was just reading some statistics recently that say that in a forest setting, about between 60 to 90% of decomposition happens from fungi. And so they're extremely important in that regard. Saprotrophic and fungi include litter decomposers like this troop of Paniolus here, or lignicolous fungi like this oyster mushroom. Lignicolous means lignin lovers. Lignin is a compound that we see in wood. And there are very few things that can actually break down that molecule into smaller pieces. Fungi, certain types of fungi are one of those. There also are some protozoans that live in termite guts that can do that as well. But fungi are the primary wood decomposers in a natural system. Okay, the second thing that I mentioned to you is that some fungi are actually a benefit to other organisms and act as mutualists. That is, they have a symbiotic relationship where both partners benefit from that relationship. Again, I should change that word right there to mushrooms. But about half of the basidiomycete mushrooms that you see are what are called mycorrhizal. That is not a typographical error. There actually are 2 R's there. Myco means fungi. Rhizae refers to roots. So it turns out that over 90% of all plant species have a mycorrhizal relationship. This is a relationship with a fungus at the roots. The deal is that the plants provide photosynthetic products, sugars, basic sugars, to the fungus. And the fungi convert nutrients, such as nitrogen and phosphorus and potassium, into usable forms for the plant. And the fungi also can serve as an enhancement for water uptake. There are 2 types of mycorrhizae, 2 basic types. Most plants have an AM relationship, arbuscular mycorrhizal relationship. This is where the exchange of nutrients happens inside of the cells of the cortex of the root. So here is the dark line right here represents hyphae, and these hyphae are penetrating into the epidermis of the root, and then into the cortex, which is the next layer in from the epidermis. And then they form these arbuscules. That's an arbuscule. The root for that is the same as Arbor Day, which means tree, right? And so they form these tree-like structures inside of those cells. This is a scanning electron micrograph. And just look at the surface area, the contact area between the fungus and the plant. By the way, these arbuscules penetrate into the cell wall, but they don't penetrate the plasma membrane or the cell membrane of the plant, of the cell. So all of those branches are wrapped in cell membrane of the plant. So the one-to-one, the contact area is just remarkable. Sometimes, by the way, the term endomycorrhizal is used for VAM, vesicular arbuscular mycorrhizae. There are certain class, one of the first ones that were discovered have these storage structures like that right there. They're called vesicles. But all of the AM fungi have arbuscules in them. So a lot of plants that you would not otherwise associate with fungi are AM plants. So all of the grasses, for example, are AM plants. Redwoods, for those of you who are familiar with collecting in redwoods, it's usually pretty depauperate. And what you do see are litter decomposers like hygroscoby and the redwood rooter, things like that. But nevertheless, at the roots, there is an AM mushroom relationship. And with one exception that I know of, none of these fungi produce fruiting bodies that you would expect to see as mushrooms. So other fungi have what are called an ectomycorrhizal relationship. And this is where the fungus actually develops a sheath of hyphae around the root tips. This is an actual photograph through a dissecting scope at the root tips that have a hyphal sheath around the root. I think of it like a corn dog. So the hot dog is the root, the cornmeal is the hyphae. Okay, so think of it that way. And so this creates a greater surface area of the root. There's an enhanced water uptake. These plants do much, much better under drought conditions because they're more able to obtain available water. And these fungi also usually produce fruiting bodies. By the way, this illustration here, which is on the cover of a book called Mycorrhizal Symbiosis, it's a great read. You know, you just got to pick it up. These pine trees right here were grown in soil between two plates of glass. And so all of the white stuff that you see is are hyphae, is mycelium from the fungi. So a lot of our familiar fungi are mycorrhizal in nature. So all of the boletes, for example. This one, by the way, this is a Rocky Mountain version of porcini. I collected this in Yellowstone. Anyway, it was good. Chanterelles, all the chanterelles are mycorrhizal. The genus Amanita, including this, this is Amanita, what's the one out on the East Coast that's deadly? Destroying Angel. It's got a long name, the white one. Out here it's Virosa. Out there it's a different one. Anyway, I'll think of it later. And there's the Matsutake right there. Matsutakes, tricholomas are also mycorrhizal. Just smell that. Red hot, some dirty socks. Yum. Now, another, at least putative mutualistic relationship are lichens. Lichens are a complex organism that are comprised of a fungal partner and an algal partner. Actually, there's some bacteria, some cyanobacteria that also serve as the photobiont. Photobiont meaning these are photosynthetic organisms. And the relationship is, or what the photobiont, the photosynthetic organism provides is similar to what a plant in a mycorrhizal situation would do, and that's simple sugars, photosynthase, for the fungus. And the fungus provides a distinctive home for the photobiont. So a long time ago, before there were people on the planet, there was this little village, and there was this guy, Alex Algae. Now, Alex was he was a really good cook. He could go to my refrigerator before I married my beautiful wife and make a gourmet meal out of what was in that refrigerator. You know, beer and mustard, basically. And he could just make. He was like a lot of the members of this society, just really good cook. The problem was he wasn't very good around the house. Everything was leaking, like the roof, for example. It was really damp in there all the time. The plumbing leaked, the screen door was off its hinges. His idea of changing a light bulb was you go buy a new lamp. You know, he was just so terrible around the house at that. Now, across town, there was this woman, Francine Fungus. Now, Francine was a home builder. She built her own home. It was a beautiful tri-level thing with decking all around, built-in jacuzzi, vaulted ceilings, sweeping stairway up, chandelier, beautiful kitchen with, granite countertops and brushed steel appliances. The problem was she couldn't cook worth a darn. She would usually go down to McDonald's, and when she did try to cook by herself, she would usually set off the smoke alarms, even if she was just making taquitos in the microwave. But she was just terrible at Well, one day, you know what? Alex and Francine met, and they took a liking to each other. Yeah, isn't that sweet? Little romance in the fungal world. Well, it turns out that that there are some people who think that Francine has Alex locked up in the kitchen and won't let him out. So the reason for that is that all of the algal and the cyanobacteria partners, so the photobionts, can live without the fungus. They're usually in wet places, like Alex's leaky house, but they do fine. Now, the fungus, on the other hand, cannot live without the photobiont. And so all of the lichen species, the thousands and thousands of lichen, I think there's 6,000 in the United States or something like that, are able to live, are named basically after the fungus because the algae are found elsewhere. So anyway, we'll see. We'll see how that works out. By the way, just to show you the pictures here, here's some fruiting bodies on a lichen. So they actually do make little mushroom-like structures, and they have spores and so on. This is a light microscope cross-section, and all of the reddish and purplish stuff is fungal in nature, and the greenish are the algae cells that are captured in the tissues of the lichen. All right, let's move on to another type of symbiosis, and that's parasitism. There are lots of fungi that are parasites. Some of these fungi cause plant diseases. So, for example, Dutch elm disease, shown here, basically that's a fungus that has changed the landscape of the eastern United States. There used to be these great big beautiful trees, elm trees, all over the eastern and midwestern United States. When this disease, which was apparently introduced from somewhere, hit, it basically turned them into stunted trees. So they're basically shrubs, all of the trees that exist. I hear actually that there's some elms that were planted in Washington State that have not been hit with this disease. But in any case, it's really changed things. By the way, my good friend Elza Vellinga, who is from Holland, wants me to tell everybody that this disease did not come from the Netherlands. It was discovered by some Dutch scientists, so that's where the name came from. Now here, closer to home, pine pitch canker is basically devastating our Monterey pines. If you drive south along the coast, and you can see just acres and acres and acres of dead pine trees caused by this fungus called Fusarium. And there's many, many other types of diseases. Chestnut blight is another one. Now, the sudden oak death is actually not a fungus. So that's a completely different type of organism, so I won't be talking about that tonight. And then honey mushrooms. So here's some honey mushrooms, Armillaria, Melia, or something like that. These actually can kill trees. They actually tap into the phloem of the trees, and they can kill them. So that's another. It's actually a parasite that forms a mushroom, which is fairly rare. Fungi also might parasitize other fungi, as well as other plants. So here is a lobster mushroom, which is probably what most people think is Russula brevipies, which is a not toxic but not sought after as an edible species type mushroom. It's sort of bland in flavor and has a weird texture. But once it gets attacked by this orange fungus, which is a Hyphae, it gives that Russula some flavor. And so people collect this and eat it once it's been parasitized like that. This is one of my favorites. This is a little mustard plant in the mustard family. And there is a fungus that infects this thing that produces yellow spores. And in addition to doing that, it elongates the central stalk of the plant. And so what does that look like? It looks like flour, doesn't it? Well, if you look closely, you can see there's a little wasp right there that has come in to investigate this nice yellow flower. And there's some evidence that this fungus actually causes the phloem, which is carries the sugars in the plant, the vascular tissue that carries sugars, causes the phloem to leak sugars out into this area. So the bees and wasps are like, yeah, this is a flower. It's nectar, right? And they just keep coming back to it. And then they carry away these yellow spores to other plants. And so that's how the spores on this plant get dispersed. Tricky. Sort of in really a devastating kind of thing that's going on is that some fungi are parasites on animals, and one of the most devastating ones of those is a type of fungus called a chytrid that is infecting the skins of amphibians, and some species are more susceptible than others, but it seems to be decimating amphibian populations around the world. There was a type of, this was first noticed back in the late 90s when there was a person who was studying a type of frog called the golden toad in Costa Rica. And they're a little frog about this big that would form these huge mating masses with literally thousands of little frogs all gathering together, have a mating situation, and then disperse from there. And so he went out and he recorded this one year, and then he went out the next year, and there were none. He couldn't find any. And they have not been seen since. And so that sort of set up the red flag. And there's a researcher at San Francisco State who is the world expert on this now, and he studies this disease called chytridiomycosis. Really doing a number. But fungi are also found on humans as well, and you all have probably experienced at least some form of athlete's foot, jock itch, yeast infection, ringworm. That's ringworm. This, if you can read this, by the way, this is from an article says, "Why doesn't anyone like ringworm? He's a fun guy." Anyway, by the way, if you ever want to gross yourself out, get a hold of a medical mycology book, and that will it's really disgusting. Now, there are some fungi that act not so much as parasites, but almost more like what we would call predators. The genus, I have to change this now because they changed the name, Ophiocordyceps, is that right? The ones that attack bugs, is that right, Danny? Ophio.
Meta, Ophio, and Cordyceps.
Okay, so there are three. This genus has been divided up into three groups. But anyway, the genus Cordyceps sensu latu, in the broad sense, has members that will infect insects, and then they will actually grow the fruiting bodies out of the insect. So this is a beetle grub right there. There's its head. And then these things right here are mushrooms that are growing out of that beetle. Aren't you glad you're not a beetle grub? Now, this also, you may have heard of cordyceps before because there is one species that's collected in the Himalaya, the lower elevations of the Himalayas, that is used in Chinese medicine and has some medicinal properties. One of my favorites is this guy right here. So this is a nematode, which is a roundworm. It's a microscopic worm. And these are hyphae. Okay? And this particular fungus has three hyphal cells that form loops. And if the nematode gets part of its body into that loop, it triggers a reaction where the water gets pushed into those hyphae, they swell up, they trap the nematode, and they eat it. Crazy. Aren't you glad you're not a nematode? There also are some that just have sticky ends as well that will trap these nematodes. There's some people are working on, there are some nematodes that are root pathogens for crops, and so they're working on ways to use these fungi as biocontrol. Speaking of biocontrol, there are some parasitic fungi that are used for that. What that means is that they're used to control pests. Here's a weevil, for example, that's being attacked by some sort of a mold that's specific to attacking that particular species of weevil. And that's being used somewhere for biocontrol. This is, I believe, in Australia. I think that's an acacia. I'm not sure. But these orange pustules are some sort of a fungal pathogen that, again, only attacks this species, and they're using it to control the weed. But some plants have turned the tables. So most achlorophyllous plants and all orchids, at least some part of their life cycle, have what are called mycoheterotrophic epiparasites. Yeah, that's going to be on the exam, don't forget. In fact, that'll be in the oral part. So here's an orchid. This is the common name is Indian pipe. This is monotropa. That's not found in California, but it's found throughout the northern part of the United States. And then here's some other ones that are mycoheterotrophic. This is a rain orchid, native orchid that we have here, snow plant, and pine drops. Now, orchids, if you know anything about them, oh, and by the way, the orchid show's this weekend. That's a great event at Fort Mason. But orchids, which is the largest plant family in the world, are unique in that they do not provide their embryo any food in the seed. Most plants, when they release a seed, they have a food source for the embryo. Think about a peanut, for example. If you break open a peanut, you see that little rabbit-eared thing, that's the embryo, and the rest of the peanut is a lunchbox that the parent gives to them and sends them off into the wilderness so that they can sprout. But orchids don't have that, so all orchids have to form this relationship with fungi. They have to parasitize fungi in order to germinate. That's one of the reasons they're so hard to grow. Now, most orchids actually become chlorophyllous later on, so you can see that there's green leaves here. Once that happens, they no longer depend upon the fungus. But there are some achlorophyllous orchids as well. So a ghost orchid, here in California we've got the coral root orchids. Those stay achlorophyllous their entire life and cannot photosynthesize, and therefore they have to form this relationship. Now, it turns out that these, in particular these groups right here, what aspect of the fungus are they getting? Well, it turns out that they parasitize mycorrhizal fungi that are getting their sugars from a pine tree or some other plant. So it's a three-way relationship. So this snow plants and pine drops and so on are stealing sugars from fungi that got them from their partner, their plant partner. Plant partner. Crazy. All right, there's some mystery things going on out there as well that apparently are pretty important ecologically as well. In particular, there are plants that have fungi called endophytes that are living inside of their leaves. Here's a photograph, microscope photograph, of some fungi that have been dyed blue, and you can see the plant cells in the background. So the plant cell is sort of brick shaped, and this is Hyphae that's growing in the cell. This relationship's not fully understood. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to try to figure out what's going on here. There's some evidence that some of them at least produce alkaloids that taste bad to cows and rabbits and so on, and so they're basically repelling them as herbivores. This picture here I got from an advertisement. It's kind of hard to see, but over here we have really healthy grass. Right there is not so healthy grass. This grass has endophytes. That grass does not have endophytes. And so there are companies that specifically sell turf that have endophytes in them. Yay, endophytes. Now, but this relationship doesn't seem to hold true for all plants and all endophytes. Oh, one more thing I wanted to tell you. There was a study done, and I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but you'll get the idea. There was a study done where they took Douglas fir needles and they sliced them up into 20 different, 20 or 24 or something like that, different little sections. Imagine doing that in the first place. You have a Douglas fir needle, and I want you to make 20 little pieces of that. Yee. Okay, so they cut it up, and then they put each piece on a petri dish, and they let these endophytes grow out in the petri dish, and they found something like 5 or 6 different species living in a single needle. And not only that, it was like more like 10 or 15 individuals, endophytic fungi living in a single needle. One thing it might be is it just might be, and it might have evolved this way and sort of has evolved other directions as well. But one thought is that it simply is there because it has a selective advantage. All leaves have a finite lifespan, and so when the leaf falls off, they're already there, ready to eat, to break down the leaf and decompose the leaf. And so there's some thought that they're just sort of cutting in line in front of other competitors. Okay, and there are some fungi that are food. Fungi are food for animals. There's no doubt about it. So fungi are going to be eaten by animals. There are some mammals that do this. So, for example, I took this picture of a swillis that had 2 teeth marks in it right there. So something came along and was chomping away at that swillis. Mushrooms that have underground fruiting bodies, so truffles and false truffles and their like, have actually evolved a technique to attract animals, that is to have a strong smell, so that they'll dig them up and they'll eat them, and then they will disperse their spores via their gut and poop them out someplace like that. This is a squirrel in Golden Gate Park that was eating some sort of an underground mushroom that it had found out there in Golden Gate Park. That's why, some of them smell good, some of them don't. The ones that smell good are worth a lot of money because, A, they're really hard to dig up. So think about truffles and training dogs to smell them, or muzzled pigs to dig them up. So it's really hard to find them because you can't pinpoint exactly where they are. Plus, they go a long ways. So if you get a fresh truffle, you don't really need to put very much of it in your pan of eggs. It'll flavor the whole pan of eggs. So a very expensive truffle will last a long time because of that really strong odor that it evolved because it's living underground. There's a bunch of arthropods that exclusively eat mushrooms. So here's a fungus gnat, for example. This is a fungus beetle. This one happens to be called the pleasing fungus beetle. Many of you have, you turn over a mushroom and there are all these little pencil point sized things jumping around on the bottom of the mushroom. Well, those are springtails, and here's a magnified version of springtails. So those also, there are certain types of springtails that are only found on fungi. There also are some insects that have actually evolved an agricultural relationship with fungi. So here, for example, are some leafcutter ants. You've all seen pictures of those in nature shows. They got the ants carrying a line of ants carrying leaves down into their nest. And the assumption is that they're leaf eaters, right? Well, actually that's not true. They are feeding the leaves to their pet fungi. So they're growing mycelium in their little galleries, and then they eat the mycelium as a result of that. This is a bark beetle called an ambrosia beetle, and these beetles are not good for foresters. They try to get rid of these because they do damage trees and they can actually kill trees. What these guys eat is also fungi. They eat mycelium that they have, that they basically have planted in the galleries of where they've their holes are in the bark, in the trees. These actually burrow into the wood. And it turns out that right behind their head, this is their head, that's the thorax, but right behind their head there are special pockets. And when one of these decides to move to another tree, it packs mycelium in those pockets, and then it goes to another tree, and it has ready to grow food source that it brought with it. Some of you may have heard about the species of termites that grow fungi for food as well. They're mostly the mound builders. So here's a termite mound, very common in lots of parts of the world, except for the Americas. Actually, they may be in South America too, I'm not sure. And they're not in Madagascar, I found out tonight, or at least not the parts of Madagascar that Jackie and Danny went to. Here's a cutaway section and showing the casts of the termites. And they have these little specialized galleries in which they grow the mycelium. And this particular mushroom actually will form fruiting bodies that will grow up out of the termite mound. It's a genus called Termitomyces. Creative, it means termite mushroom. And they can be quite big. So, and they're edible. So that'll feed a lot of people for a long time. Pretty cool. And then, of course, there is that one animal that probably eats more fungi than any other animal. And that animal is Mark Lockerbie. Here's Mark at Mendo, cooking up some chanterelles or something. And here's a nice basket with some porcini and some cauliflower fungi in there as well. Okay, so there's all of our local mycological societies. Hopefully you'll get more involved with fungi and how they work and their ecology. Thank you very much. So Tyler's going to get the lights there.
So you don't have to tell me where you got Tyler training.
I'm working on it.
Yeah.
He's a little slow. But, yeah. So hit the upper left one there. There we go. Okay, I have plenty of time for questions. Anybody have one? Yeah. What's your name?
Mary.
Mary.
I just wondered, so do the orchids do they form a mycorrhizal relationship after they've been parasitizing the mycorrhizae?
No. That's a good question, actually. I'm not sure if they form AM mycorrhizae or not. That's a good question. I'll have to look that up.
The orchid show is this weekend. You can go and find it.
Yeah, maybe their information will be there. Any other questions? Neil?
Yes, so when the haploids form with two different nuclei, have they determined how different the mushroom is? Is there different pairs? The same mushroom fruit body initially, and two pairs go off, and another two pairs go off. How different are those?
Oh, I think I know what you're talking about. So we go back here to, let's see. Go back to the life cycle. Okay, so what this is showing is that these two mating types are coming from the same fungus, right? Is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. This is actually only one of several ways that this can happen. So just like with plants, some plants can self, which means that they can the pollen from this plant can land on the pistil of the same plant and will result in a seed or offspring, right? Same thing with fungi. Some can do that. Most actually are more the other way, where these two spores are not mating compatible if they come from the same fungus. So this is just a cartoon sort of representing one way that can happen. And so genetically, there's recombination going on here. That's what's going on. That's why this event happens. Where fertilization happens is you have the genes from mom and the genes from dad, or the genes from red and the genes from blue. They're mixing together. They're recombining. And so the inference is that these two cells here are going to be different than those were there. Does that make sense? So there's shuffling of genetics that goes on. But I don't know if anyone's actually specifically looked at that kind of thing. Joe.
Yeah, on that same note, and maybe there hasn't been enough study on this before, but if you have maybe up to 100 different sexual partners or different sexual types, would that cause a difference in characteristics of the fruiting body? For instance, maybe a gregarious cluster of the same mushroom versus a solo mushroom of the same species?
I don't know of any studies like that, but my guess is probably not. I mean, there may be a little bit of difference in size or shade of the color, that kind of thing. But I don't know of any studies in that regard. By the way, just to kind of give you an idea of how they know this, so if you take a petri dish, which is basically a dish that has a bunch of food in it, and you put a spore on one side and a spore on the other side, so they can make what are called single spore isolates. So you put a single individual on one side, a single individual on the other side. If they're mating compatible, they'll fuse together into that two nuclei structure. That's called dikaryotic, by the way. If they're not mating compatible, so a red one and a red one, they form what's called a line of antagonism. You can actually see this in the middle of the petri dish. Sort of like back in medieval days when they put the sword between the virgin and the guy. I don't do that anymore. Any other questions? Yeah. Eric.
I've heard that the process of people picking mushrooms enhances the prospects for that type of mushroom to propagate itself, and so I would like. What is it about people picking mushrooms for fun and food that does something for the mushroom that the mushroom can't do for itself?
Okay. I don't know. Okay, so I know of two studies that have actually looked at this, right? There's one on chanterelles, a really long one actually, and I think it's still going on, and one on matsutake. Now, with chanterelles, with the chanterelle study, what they did is they had three different treatments. They had a control where they just left the chanterelles on the ground. One thing about chanterelles, by the way, is year after year you can predict where they're going to come up. So this was an ideal study. Another one, they cut them right at the base and left a little piece in the ground. Okay. The third one, they just plucked them. No difference in any of them in fruiting from year to year. Okay. In fact, there was a little bit more fruiting, more mushrooms fruited in the ones where they picked them or cut them, but significantly not very much. The matsutake one. Now, if you know anything about matsutakes, they have their grades of matsutakes, and when you pick a matsutake, see if I can remember where that is. So here we go. So here's some matsutake, and that's a bit old, actually. And so if you would get less money for that one than you would for one that hasn't opened up yet. And the ones that haven't opened up yet are what do they call them? Grade 1.
Grade 1 button.
Grade 1 buttons, right?
Button.
Yeah. The problem is with matsutakes is that those grade 1 buttons are underground. You don't see the matsutakes until they've opened up and they have burst through the soil, right? And so how do people collect them? The ones who want to get more money, they rake the soil, and they change the way that they change the hydrology of the soil. They dry it out, and especially if they don't put it back. So they found out that there was a significant difference in fruiting from that. So I say that the take-home message for that is if you're going to be collecting underground mushrooms, whether it be grade 1 mozzies, or if it's truffles or anything like that, that you replace the soil, keep the hydrosphere in good shape in that sense. So that's one thing you can do. I think another thing that you're talking about is the idea that you put your boletes or your mozzies or chanterelles in a basket, and as you're walking through the woods, you're spreading the spores. Probably not a whole lot. Because really, when a mushroom gets to this stage, all of these right here, they've already pretty much done, they've spread their spores. And so by the time you collect them, they are no longer, a source, a really important source for sporulation. It's sort of past that. And that's actually an argument for allowing collecting, because if you only collect mature mushrooms, you're not affecting the population, because they've already done what they need to do. They're fruiting bodies. They're designed, they've evolved to spread their spores, and so they've already done that. So that's sort of one thing we can talk about. Ken?
Back to the spreading of spores, and if you have a purple and a blue, and those are both haploids, and they sprout. So let me know if I'm getting anything correct here. They both sprout, and they each make a mycelium growing.
They both germinate, yeah.
They both germinate, and they
Yeah.
make a mycelium,
Yeah.
each of them.
Yeah.
They haven't reached each other yet, but
Yeah.
they're out there. Is it known that those are saprotrophic, or they're mycorrhizal at that stage?
Oh, yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
I don't think that is known, actually.
Well, I was always conjecturing that it seems to me that they would be saprotrophic or saprotrophic at that stage, and then when they come together and mate, the baby is parasitic on those two parents because they're still connected until it finds a root, and then it connects to the parent. Connects to the tree, and now, in other words, they're saprotrophic, then the baby becomes parasitic until it becomes mycorrhizal to the tree. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's really big gaps in our knowledge about, how do those mycorrhizal fungi that really are dependent upon a photosynthetic partner, how do they find it in the first place? How does there's a big gap in our knowledge about how that works. I'm pretty sure there's people working on it, but I don't know enough about it to speak to it. But that would make sense. And they've also have recently found that there are fungi that can do either way. They can be saprotrophic under certain circumstances and mycorrhizal under other circumstances. Bill and then by the way, did you stay awake the whole time? Okay.
Can you give them this talk about saprotrophic, that fruiting bodies and so forth?
Yeah. All I need to be is invited. Nino.
So, we frequently would find morels in wood chips, around parking lots that are recently. So does that mean they're
Saprotrophic?
are
So
they phytocytes?
saprophytes?
No, I'm trying to say, are they getting the bark in the tree itself, and then when the bark
Parasites.
is chipped, and then they're now spread, and they'll be looking
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think that's how that's happening.
There's some idea that the Slosby cytosins was grown on the inside bark of the alder trees when the chips came down to the bare area to grow.
Huh? I suppose it's possible. There's spores everywhere. So, and as long as the conditions are right, they're going to germinate. So I suppose that's possible. It sounds like they used to think that hummingbirds migrated on the backs of swans. So it kind of sounds like that to me. I know that's disrespectful. All right, thank you very much.